Welcome to Know What I Mean. My name's George.
My name's Oscar. Yeah, this was really cool. This was a really cool episode. It got into a really nice flow. It felt like we could kind of weave in some interesting personal stuff into there. And it also felt very practical, actually. I think just talking through it and trying to actually figure out, all right, so, how does one deal with anxiety? How do we deal with anxiety? What is it? I really hope that you come away with a sense of something that you can do from this one, actually, because I feel more clear on that after recording. So
I totally agree with that. Like, I think it was a nice little nugget of information about this topic. And yeah, definitely talking through it helped me understand it as well. You had like a cool metaphor that you brought out at the end, which I thought really, really worked so well for it. So I hope you enjoy and I hope you get something out of it. Let's get into the episode. Okay.
Yeah.
So the quote for this week is from Alan Watts, probably one of the most quoted people, I think, on this podcast. 100%, and it goes as follows. One is a great deal less anxious if one feels perfectly free to be anxious. And I think this is a really important quote. Like this concept that we're talking about here is can have a really big impact on your life. It definitely has on mine. And I think really the core of it is basically when you do have a worry or a feeling of anxiety, it's just kind of accepting that. Because what can happen is you start to worry about something and then you kind of worry that you're worrying and that makes you feel more anxious, and it can be this loop that continues. And really what this is the practice of just stopping it getting carried away as you have these, like an emotion of worry or anxiety arises. Just noticing that and being like, yeah, that's going to happen. Sometimes I'm going to feel anxious. Sometimes I'm going to feel worried about things. And it just means that you can really just let go of that and cut that off before it kind of spirals out of control. Yeah, it's I had something that I was just about to say. It's gone. I'm sure we'll get back to it.
Don't worry about it.
Yeah,
don't get anxious about it.
Yeah, I won't do. Go for it. Yeah, you say something.
Okay. Yeah, I love the essence of this quote. I think it captures something really important, which is that so much of the suffering that comes with feeling anxious is feeling anxious about being anxious, like the lack of acceptance of the anxiety itself. It's a really tricky one because, and we can talk about it in this episode actually, there's quite a lot of stigma around being anxious, really. Obviously there's stigma around mental health, but I think actually just admitting to yourself or admitting to other people that you feel worried or that you feel upset about something, it is a sign of vulnerability. It's saying that, you know, I'm not coping in some way. I'm not able to cope with this situation. And that can be really quite scary. I know I feel like I'm quite a open person, and that's a training and just being as honest as possible with people. And yet I do find myself feeling like I'm failing in some way when I get anxious sometimes. I'll have a story running saying, and it will almost always come with the word should. I should feel another way. I shouldn't feel anxious. I should be able to cope with this. And it's really, it's really, I think even with training that does slip in as this thing of, if I feel anxious, I'm doing something wrong. I shouldn't feel anxious. I shouldn't need to feel anxious. I should just be able to accept this situation, and yet I can't, and I feel really worried about it. And so in Buddhism, there's a talk of this thing called the second dart. With suffering, or say with anxiety, you've got the first dart, which is just feeling anxious. Just like you're triggered by something and a sense of tension and tightness just comes up within the body. So that's the first dart. But then we have this tendency of throwing a second dart, which is saying, oh, I ought to not be feeling this. This is wrong.
Yeah.
This experience is wrong. I really shouldn't feel the way that I'm feeling right now. And that's what we have control over, is that second dart. We can put in conditions, we can put in things in place to reduce the likelihood that we feel anxious about things. But ultimately, it might just come up. You know, we might get triggered by something. We might feel anxious about something. But really, where a lot of the control happens is, but how do I respond to my own anxiety about this situation? Am I going to be free to be anxious? Am I going to say, this is okay that I feel anxious? It is really, there is an okayness to it, even if it feels very tight and it feels very constricting. There can be this very thin layer of okayness around the whole experience, which is just holding it. And I know, you know, everyone listening will relate to the difference between feeling completely overwhelmed by anxiety and feeling anxious, but that there is also a space of okayness around that anxiety.
Yeah.
And how significant that difference actually is.
Yeah. Because there can be times where you feel the same physical feeling of anxiety, but say, for example, you're going to like a theme park and you're feeling anxious as you're about to go on a ride. You've put yourself in that situation and you wanted to go through this experience. So you are feeling anxious, and it is really the same feeling. It's like if you look within your body, it's exactly the same, like the physical feeling. The only thing that's changed is the story around it. And sometimes it can be hard to separate those two things. We just think of them as all kind of molded together. But there really are two separate things: the sensations in the body, and then the story about the sensations, what those sensations mean. And that's an example of, if you've put yourself in this situation, you can feel anxious, but you have no problem with it because you're also excited to go on this ride or whatever it is.
Yeah, it's a nice example of when the narrative going alongside the feeling of anxiety is that, oh, this is welcome, this is okay, this is appropriate, this is normal, that I feel tight and tense in the body. I suppose it might be good to clarify, being that, so much of this episode is around anxiety, like what we're talking about, like what's anxiety actually referring to. Sometimes I say that I feel anxious and it is just a bodily sensation, but often I say I feel anxious and it's sort of it's a meeting of some sort of future projection, like mental future projection, which is then triggering a feeling of tension in the body. And I call that relationship anxiety. It's a story. There's some layer of story saying, this is wrong, this shouldn't be here, this shouldn't be happening, or what if this happens at some point, and it's often very future orientated. And then in the body, then it's like, I feel very constricted by that. So I wonder if maybe, I think it varies, like what people are actually referring to when they say anxiety. So I'm kind of interested in that.
Yeah, no, it can be quite a broad thing, but yeah, I'm thinking of it as just that feeling. I'm kind of using it interchangeably with worry, really. Like if you're kind of worrying about something. Well, I guess with worry, it's usually more specific. It's, you're worrying about a particular thing happening. Whereas anxiety can be more of a general feeling that might be a little bit trickier to pinpoint exactly where it's coming from, or it might be, multiple things that are coming together.
Yeah.
I think one of the keys with this quote, with just feeling free to be anxious, or, accepting that it's okay to feel how you're feeling. One of the great things about this is compared to the alternative, which is where you feel that it's not okay to be anxious and you start thinking about, why you shouldn't be anxious. And what happens is you can start to feel more anxiety, but also you're getting further and further away from the actual initial cause. So you'll get to this point where you're feeling anxious, but you're so many levels of abstraction, and you've added so much complexity to this that it just feels like a complete mess and you're just feeling bad, and it doesn't really seem to be connected to a particular stimulus or a particular thing that you're scared about. It's just like this general mess of not feeling good. And really, from thinking about it anyway, it seems to me that the way that this ball of kind of anxiety arises is from just a tangle of feeling like I shouldn't feel this, I shouldn't do this. And so much of it is your internal judgments of yourself and how you shouldn't be feeling and everything. And it just gets further and further away from, physical things of like, I'm feeling anxious because there's like an immediate threat right here. That's really what that emotion is for like, either there's something right now that's about bad that could potentially happen, or you're projecting, if I continue doing this, or, this place could be dangerous, so it makes sense to feel anxious. But a lot of what can happen now in our, a society that's more complex, and there's more of our fears are abstract and constructed rather than like very real fears of like whether we're going to eat tonight or whether we're going to have shelter or whatever it is. And it just means that things can get too complex and just be really general and hard to get to the bottom of. So I think that's one thing with this practice of just accepting these moments of anxiety and just letting them go. And just whenever they come up, just letting them go. That is something which is helpful within the moment, but it's also helpful on a longer term, because it really does help things stay more sorted in your mind and getting less confused, less carried away with all these like crazy thoughts that are connected to each other and just, just going away with it. So it's really good to kind of cut those threads before they get all tangled up and harder to sort through.
I guess the tricky thing with anxiety is that it's often quite irrational, even though it can, I know in my experience, it can feel like the thing that you're anxious about, it makes sense. Am I going to have enough work? Something like that, say. That can on some level make sense, but it's irrational in the sense that feeling anxious about it really isn't going to be the thing that changes it. I'm not actually going to act. I'm going to feel debilitated by that experience. I'm not going to feel like acting on it. So it doesn't make sense on that level. And I suppose, for example, I could imagine having, feeling triggered by something, having a sense of anxiety and really wanting to be okay with the fact that I feel anxious. But because of that momentum of thinking of not okayness, this isn't okay, this shouldn't be happening, it's really difficult to not get kind of carried away by that. So the ways that I personally dealt with this in my life, because I've noticed this change hugely. Like I get anxious regularly, but this quite really captures the significant change from a combination of just growing up and dealing with things differently naturally because of that. And then also my spiritual practice or just working with the mind and self-development. So connecting with just growing up, and I'm quite curious to hear from people if people have this experience as well, because I just find it really interesting. I've noticed that I'm able to be more okay with being anxious purely from the fact that I have more data to go off. I have more experience of life. And that means that I've seen the cycles of anxiety so many times that I know that they're impermanent. I know that, I feel anxious now, but later I'm not going to feel anxious. It is going to go. Whereas when I was younger, I felt I'd often have the story when I got anxious that, this is just how I am now then. I just get anxious in social situations. That's it. Oh, fucking hell, I fucked it. Like, that's it. Whereas now I know that sometimes in social situations I feel anxious, other times I don't. And that's purely from the data. Like I literally just I've had this experience the last few days. So I've been doing a job painting in a cafe, and I was working alongside 3 electricians who were also working on site. And this isn't a big cafe. So we were trying to kind of work around each other. And also these are guys that work together as part of a team all the time. They're quite laddie, and there was a lot of banter that they were having between themselves, right? And add on the top of that they've got like really strong northern accents. Like I think a couple of them are from Bolton, maybe one from Manchester. So I couldn't quite understand what they were saying sometimes as well. So there was this kind of banter and energy, which reminded me of school, basically. And the way that I dealt with situations like that at school was that I would shut down and I'd become really quiet because I wouldn't know what to say and I wouldn't be able to keep up with the kind of banter. So I'd kind of shut down. And I noticed in this situation where I was working that the same response was happening. I was shutting down. I wasn't being social. And quite quickly, it was like I was being identified by these people as being someone quite quiet or someone a bit shy or awkward, right? So if that had happened 3 or 4 years ago, that would have been really bad for my sense of self and identity and my self-esteem, because the story would have been, oh, I can't cope with these social situations. I thought I was over this. I thought I was able to like get along with anyone and just chat with anyone. No, you know, like I'm regressing, whatever, right? But the last few days, it's just been like, I felt more shy because I haven't felt I could keep up with the banter. I don't really know how to relate to the people that I'm with. Like I just struggled with that for the topics of conversation, all that kind of stuff. But it was like, that's okay. You know, I can't get along with everyone. And this is just for a few days. And I know in myself, like last night I went out after this job where I was being quite quiet and just met a load of strangers for like a design event and was chatting to everyone. It's like, I know that that's not me. It's not me to like be super shy and awkward, but that's purely just because I've got enough data. I've seen these cycles enough times that I'm now cool with, you know, this talks about anxiety, this quote, but I'm okay with being shy sometimes. It's not, that doesn't mean that that's who I am all the time. That's just what happens sometimes. And there's more space around it and it's fine. It's okay. Like I felt awkward. Yeah. It's just like, well, fine. You know, it's really not. And that feels just, it's not purely experience because there is a trait, there has been a training aspect in there for me, which I can talk about in a bit, but I think largely just like growing up and seeing myself in enough different situations to know that I'm not just one thing. If I get anxious, I'm not an anxious person. I'm just experiencing anxiety because I've been in so many situations where I haven't been anxious. So I know that to not be true from the evidence. Yeah. You know,
that's interesting as well. How you just said it there of like, you can experience anxiety or be anxious, but not be an anxious person. And in hypnosis, they actually talk about this quite a lot of, you know, when say if someone's quitting smoking, a lot of what can be helpful is changing the language around it of like, people say like, oh, I'm a smoker, changing it to like, I used to smoke or whatever it is. It's very different when it's, you have your identity and then you have your behavior. And those are two different things. And that can really be quite damaging or very limiting when you do something, you say you feel shy in a situation, and then you add that label to yourself of like, I am a shy person. Yeah. And that can be quite damaging rather than just being more open to being different and experiencing the world in all sorts of different ways and just being like, oh yeah, I was feeling more shy then, or oh, I felt more confident here. Oh, I felt this. Oh, I felt that. And you don't need to just make it this big dramatic thing that, especially like as a teenager, you can do. I think you told a story as well when you had like a party where you just felt like super cool. And you're like, I'm the cool guy now. Like, this is me forever. I'm just going to be like, like cool as shit wherever the fuck I go. Like, like and that definitely is some like a more immature mindset of like, and it's something that we can still fall into for sure. You've still got to check yourself on it. Yeah, that is quite a funny one that you can fall into of like, it's going to be like this forever. And it really can feel like that when you're in a certain state. Definitely growing up and going through more of those experiences gives you more of an idea of like, okay, this is not just it. Like, there's not always going to be like this. I don't know where it's from, but I think it might be a Bible thing actually, but it's, and this too shall pass. And that quote really is about you have the positive and that will pass as well. And that's kind of a reason to really appreciate those positive moments. And the negative arises and that will pass as well. And that's a reason to not freak out and feel like this is the rest of your life. And you really need to do it on both sides, because what can happen is when you're feeling good, you know, kind of the inverse of this quote is when you're feeling in a really great mood, say you're feeling really confident, you can't try too hard to cling on to that, because the act of trying to cling on to that and hold it is just going to make you not appreciate it, make it slip through your fingers. And really, the wider context of this quote is about just really being there and experiencing all the different things that you're going to experience, the positives and the negatives, and just not getting caught up in these stories about like, oh, this is me, I'm always going to be like this, or whatever it is, because that's where so much suffering can come from. You can make yourself suffer from even the good parts of life when you do that, because you feel the positive and then you start trying to cling on to it. And then, that makes you start feeling anxious about not being quite as cool as you were the last time. And then you start to feel anxious, and then you feel negative that you're feeling anxious. And like, it's just this cycle of not really accepting who you are being right now. And, you can still have things where you maybe notice over time, rather than catastrophizing about one particular event. But if you can notice over time, like, okay, I do seem to be quite shy in these sorts of situations, you can do things like, I'm definitely much more confident in social situations than I used to be. And, a lot of that is just from slightly pushing myself, slightly pushing my comfort zone. And that means that in general, if you take all of it, I feel more free in social situations than I used to. And there's those two sides of it. You can still work on these things, but within that moment when you're feeling that anxiety or whatever, it's so important to just accept that rather than running away with it and browbeating yourself about feeling that.
Yeah, because that is what this quote is about, is not holding on too tightly to whatever, So if there's anxiety there, then not gripping that and being like, why is this here? And like, oh, like, no, this should not be here. And trying to force it out, trying to either, like, it's very easy to start, being dishonest with yourself about how you're really feeling. Even when you are feeling anxious, you kind of like there, like, just like, this isn't happening, or trying to distract yourself out of it. But like it's, so in this, it goes both ways in the sense of that. So this quote particularly is about anxiety and not holding too tightly to anxiety when it comes along, allowing it to exist, allowing yourself to experience anxiety, which we can talk about kind of methods for that, because it's hard work. But then also, as you say, like the opposite is true. It's just like, if you're feeling very charismatic, say one evening, you just, all the stars align and you just feel very, very comfortable around people. You're able to, like, conversations flowing, like not holding on too tightly to that either, giving that space and saying, oh, this is a visitor. It's a visitor. It's not, this isn't me now. This is just, this is a blessing. This has just come along. It'll be different tomorrow. Like, enjoy it while it's there, kind of thing. And with the thing of noticing as time's gone on, how like my perspective has changed on it, and that thing of like being a teenager, that experience, which I'm sure is quite universal, of, I suppose, because you're changing so rapidly over such a short period of time, and you're trying on so many different outfits in terms of identity, you feel like one of them might just stick around, like it's, oh, that's it then, and it's just permanent, and there's a permanence to it. Whereas in time, you notice that actually things are changing, it's much more in flux than it seems at that age, right? But that's definitely like quite hands off in terms of, haven't really done anything about that. That's just an insight that's come through age, and that's cool. But so it's worth noting, like, the changes that can happen, but also like there's not much you can do about it. It's just like, that's an insight that, like if I met a teenager now, or if a teenager was listening, and this experience of feeling like, of gripping tightly to identity as soon as it comes along, either positively or negatively, if that's the experience, the advice definitely wouldn't be like, don't do that, because it's just like, okay, it's more just, okay, play with that, explore that, and just see what happens basically in time. It's likely that sort of dynamic will change naturally in time. That's fine. I think what's in the area of, as you said, like, I don't think it's a Bible thing, but the this too shall pass thing, I did hear a story where that came from, but anyway, this too shall pass, that kind of segues quite nicely into something that is more deliberate, I think, which is, so this too shall pass is well, it's wisdom, really. It's seeing everything changes, it's impermanence, and that really brings a lot of ease to whatever you're experiencing. Even if it is anxiety, you've got anxiety, you really say this too shall pass, and it doesn't feel so threatening anymore. You know, it is a passing thing, it's a passing experience. And then, but I think like it's such a huge one really for me is becoming more in touch with the body. And that's happened over a long period through meditation and quite actively checking in with what's going on inside my body. Because anxiety, for example, like it's thought plus feeling. So a lot of it happens in the body, really. You know, you can have an anxious style of thought, but if you're not experiencing anxiety in your body, then it isn't anxiety. You know, the bodily sensation, that's what makes it, really. And so how do you become familiar with the emotional landscape that's going on within? And that's really where the space that we were kind of talking about earlier of having. So I really do notice that. So you can imagine like a kind of ball of anxiety in the stomach, or I get it mainly in the chest. It's like, I really do think of it almost like that's kind of an orb. It's like this sphere of anxiety. It's quite like intense sensation. And when I become aware of it and I allow space around it, it is almost like it's got breathing room. Like it can exist in a wider context. It's not like everything. It's not my whole body. It's not my whole experience. It's it's an existing kind of entity. And then there's space around that. And that space is what makes it bearable. And I feel like that's the practice, really, is like you've got a strong sensation, unpleasant sensation, say, so that's when you're going to remember to do this. And can I just be aware of that sensation? Can I just be, instead of, because the natural mechanism is to want to turn away from it and want to do something else and want to try and either deceive yourself out of the sensation by just denying that it exists altogether, or do something that's going to distract you strongly enough that it goes away by the time you look back at it. Like those things don't really work. So it's like coming actually into a relationship with this sensation and seeing if there's a possibility of allowing some space, some breathing room around it. And that's it. That's kind of the best that you can do. You know, there's a really nice saying from Zen Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, which butchered the pronunciation, but that is the name, sort of. And, you know, he talks about you have to hold anxiety like a crying baby. You hold it like a crying baby. And that's the sort of gentleness and receptivity that you need. You don't tell a baby like, shut up, or like you don't ignore the baby. You don't just leave, you know, you hold it and you just do what you can, you know, you're just receptive to it. And then at a certain point, then the baby stops crying, you know, and that's the attitude that needs to kind of come with it, I think.
I think that's a very nice metaphor to move on to the next quote with.
Sweet. This is a bit of a strange one. It's a lot more self-development-y than the quote we've just done, I think, but it's good. So this is another quote by James Clear, and it seems we've got a little we've got our main guests who aren't aware of this podcast that come through.
Yeah.
Apparently James Clear is one of them. So he wrote the book Atomic Habits, which I'm reading at the moment, and the quote is, 3 simple ways to get more of what you want in life. Number 1, be kind and pleasant to others. Number 2, ask for what you want. Number 3, follow up.
Nice. Well, that's quite a nice little practical one, actually. It's quite nice to do, because normally we do like a quote, or like, do you know what I mean? Like more of a particular, like a little bit of wisdom. But yeah, that's interesting.
it's a little, maybe a little bit more businessy, but I think it will definitely kind of go into that area of, well, just what kind of relationship do you want with how you act in the world? And I think this like really covers like a lot of very, well, just effective, very straightforward like tools that will make things better. All right. Well, it's been a pleasure as always. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, if you enjoyed Know What I Mean podcast in general, it would be lovely if you could share it. And please do get in touch with any thoughts. If you've liked this episode, if you haven't, then we'd love to hear anyway. And you can chat to us through the Know What I Mean Instagram, knowwhatimean.podcast. And you can email us, which is in the description for this episode. So thank you so much for listening. And we shall see you next week.
Peace.